Hey, For the Wild community, Ayana here. And before we get into our conversation with Alexandra Morton on the horrors of BC salmon farms, I wanted to let you know how you all can take action and support this incredibly critical ecosystem. So one, Alexandra is asking for support right now in writing to the Premier of BC to respectfully request and really demand that the Premier of British Columbia do away with the salmon farms in the waters off the west coast of BC. His email is premier@gov.bc.ca. You could also contact the Minister of Fisheries Canada and tell them that it's not acceptable to be introducing an Atlantic virus into the Pacific. Alexandra is also mounting litigations against these huge corporations and their corporate lawyers, and she needs help with her legal fees. So head over to alexandramorton.ca where you can see her research and make a contribution. In other news, we are loving all of the music submissions that we're getting from our incredibly talented community. So if you are a musician and you'd like your music showcased on the podcast, go over to forthewild.world and upload your tunes there. And lastly, if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast, email us at engage@forthewild.world. We're looking forward to building new partnerships. Thanks so much, and now on to the show.
British Columbia has this enormous decision to make on the 20th of June. Premier John Horgan, the Premier of British Columbia, has to decide whether he's going to renew the fish farm tenures in a quarter of the industry. All of these fish farms are in Indigenous territories where some of them have been occupying the fish farm facilities, and then the science is just raining down on them. The chefs in British Columbia are rejecting the farm salmon product. There's all kinds of lawsuits. I'm involved in several of them.
The silence is broken by somebody crying, trying to be heard, never a word. Always the attitude, sort out your own, always alone, wishing for something the world is denying. Out in the wilderness somebody's crying. Somebody wishing for something to happen, wishing to tell, wishing to help. Someone was listening, someone who cared, never despaired. Someone to lean on and someone to trust, who needs your assistance and finds your disgust.
Hello and welcome to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. Today we are speaking with Alexandra Morton. Alexandra is an independent biologist who followed whales into a remote archipelago in 1984 and made it her home and study area. When the salmon farming industry began displacing the whales and salmon, Morton began a 30-year effort to protect the BC coast from this form of intense monoculture. Morton has published numerous scientific papers on the impact of salmon farms, taken the industry to court, met with its CEOs in Norway, and became a frontline activist with the First Nations in the territory where she is doing her research. She tracks viruses today, not whales. Alex has been featured on 60 Minutes, in the New York Times, and is the subject of several documentaries. She is a solutionist with practical solutions to help humanity learn to live with the natural world, something she sees as critical to the lives of the children growing into the world. We make or break for them today. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for the dedication of your work and for joining us today to help us unpack some of the complexities around salmon and the ecosystems that they stem from.
Well, thank you, because, truly, if a tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, it just falls. And so it's incredibly important at this point that people hear about these things and really understand and know that they actually have the power to stop this. I mean, I can just bring it forward and you can broadcast it, but it really is up to all the individuals, because power of one is all we have, but we all have it. And there's a lot of us. So thank you.
Well, I'm so appreciative of your incredible research and your fierce truth-telling voice on behalf of the salmon and all they interconnect. And you've spent your life immersed in an intimate relationship with the marine world of British Columbia's sinuous coastline. And I'd love to ask you to begin by sharing why you now study viruses infecting wild Pacific salmon populations instead of the matriarchal orca cultures that led you to BC over 30 years ago.
The short answer is that the whales can't do this for themselves. And the long answer is I have become entwined in the biology of salmon and this coast. And it's a common experience for really all biologists that go into the field and do long-term research, because what happens is we have the numbers on the situation. We know what should be there and what is not there. And I personally spend, virtually every waking hour trying to figure out how to inform people that you don't want to lose this incredible power cord. This is what salmon are. They go out in the open ocean as a tiny fish, and they basically collect the energy of the sun hitting the open ocean. Is when the sun hits the ocean, plankton blooms, and larger plankton eat it, and then fish eat that, and larger fish eat those fish, and then our salmon eat those little fish and package them into a delicious flesh and bring it back to our coast. So eagles, whales, bears, seals, sea lions, everybody sets their clock to the salmon. And then they do this incredible thing. They defy gravity, and they carry ocean nitrogen and phosphorus up into the forests. And you actually can measure the size of a salmon run by the growth rings on a tree. And you can track nitrogen 15. It's only found in the ocean, but it's all through British Columbia's forests on up into the alpine meadows, because the fish go in there, predators eat them. They carry the fish inside them, and when they relieve themselves, they release this nitrogen, and it literally feeds the forest. So salmon feed the trees that make the oxygen we breathe. And, as a girl, I read every single book on biologists going into the wilderness, beginning with Jane Goodall's work. But every single story was in 3 parts. First, part 1 was, oh, wow, wow, the animals are so amazing. The environment is so incredible. Living out in the wilderness was always a rewarding and challenging experience for everybody. Part 2 of everyone's life is always, everything I'm seeing now is unraveling due to some blind human behavior. And then, part 3 is trying to talk to politicians, bringing in graduate students, trying to make local people aware that the animals are worth more to them alive. And so I went into this armed and prepared, and I was not going to go into part 2 and 3. I really just wanted to figure out what the orca, or killer whales, were saying. Why was this huge brain communicating so beautifully and complexly? I wanted to figure it out. But when fish farms came in, I didn't see them for what they were. I thought they were a good idea. I thought we were living in a little community with a one-room school, at only 200 people, and the thought of more jobs in that remote location, doing a benign thing like growing salmon in a pen, I thought, oh, wow, this is perfect. In fact, I applied for a job. But then my neighbors came to me, particularly the fishermen, and the fishermen were teachers to me because they were salmon predators that could speak, whereas the orca are salmon predators whose language I didn't understand. And so I was constantly going to fishermen, asking them, why when the whales go up Kinkum Inlet in the spring, is there 6 inches of their dorsal fin showing the whole time? And they don't do that anywhere else. And the guys would be like, oh yeah, that's because the glacial meltwater is exactly 6 feet deep and they've got their eyes right below it. So they knew a lot. But it reversed when the salmon farms came in. They came to me. I was the only person with a word processor, is what we called them at the time, and they said, "Hey, look, they're putting these things in all the wrong places." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, they're putting them on the hot spots where the salmon are, the prawns are, the rock cod are in particular." And I said, "Oh, okay, guys, yeah, I got this. I'll let DFO, or Fisheries and Oceans, know. I'm sure they've made a mistake." And that was in 1987. And they were not making a mistake. In fact, they were the industry, the salmon farming industry, was methodically finding those places where there was the most oxygen, the most fresh water, and all these things. Everything the wild fish needed, their fish needed. And so they put their farms basically on the vital organs of this archipelago. And she began to collapse. She's so strong, it took a long time, but it's pretty bad right now. And so the viruses, I started with studying the escaped Atlantics, because that's what they're raising here, Atlantic salmon in the Pacific. And then I began studying the sea lice epidemics, which happen in every country this industry operates in. Sea lice just explode in the feedlots that these farms are. And then the larval lice come out and they just eat the wild fish to death. The wild fish just aren't built for it. And then I got privy to information on some of the diseases in these farms. I thought, oh, gee, somebody ought to be looking into these viruses. I didn't think I was going to be able to do that because I'm not a virologist, but I'm a very good field scientist, and I teamed up with a virologist, and so I'm just the field end, and I do all the collections and help write the papers up. And so, yeah, we're discovering these Norwegian viruses spreading through the Pacific, and the term go viral is frightening to me because they really do go viral. Viruses are incredible things, and which is why 95% of the farm salmon in the supermarkets have the virus, and it's alive. I personally would never eat farm salmon sashimi that hasn't been cooked because, I don't know what the virus, there's just no work that's been done on what this virus is doing to humans. But I'm afraid of it because it's so durable. It is a tough little virus. Like when I study other viruses, you have to handle them so carefully. If the fish, you have to sample the fish, immediately after death. There can't be any warming of the sample. The weather has to be perfect. They're really fragile. Not this thing. It's like a rubber snake. It just doesn't break. And I have no idea what it's doing to people, but it does scare me, I have to say. Definitely wash your hands after touching farm salmon. And yeah, personally, I wouldn't eat farm salmon sashimi. I'm racing this virus right now called Piscine reovirus, trying to get out ahead of it. But it's difficult, and at the moment, I'm not winning.
I want to delve a bit more into some specifics on PRV, this Piscine reovirus that's devastating Pacific salmon. So could you tell us how this Norwegian virus found itself in Pacific waters? And then how does PRV manifest in salmon? What are their physical symptoms? Does it affect all species of Pacific salmon, whether that's Chinook, pink, sockeye, coho? Does it affect them all the same way?
When salmon farming started in British Columbia, they started with Chinook and coho, which are Pacific salmon. But those fish just didn't do very well in the pens. They couldn't take the crowding. And it was Norwegian operators that looked at this coast and decided they wanted to farm here. And so they started to buy up these little failing farms, and they brought with them Atlantic salmon. And the reason they brought Atlantic salmon is because they had bred them for captivity, and they were like bringing your prize Black Angus cows or your Holsteins or your prize sheep from wherever. It's something that farmers do, and so they simply brought Atlantic salmon. But the trouble with the fish farms, of course, is that they're in pens and net pens, and so everything that's in the farm gets out, except hopefully the fish, but all the bacteria and the viruses and the sea lice and the waste and the mucus and the feces. And so they brought all these fish. Beginning in about 84, they started to come into British Columbia. And in 2010, Piscine reovirus was discovered. By then, it had swept through the Norwegian industry for 10 years. Nobody knew what it was, but the farm salmon were getting skinny and weak. They could barely move. Sometimes they would recover, and sometimes they would die. But nobody knew why until 2010. And by then, over 30 million Atlantic salmon had come into British Columbia. And not directly from Norway. They came from Scotland, Ireland, Washington State, Iceland. But the predominant strain of Atlantic salmon is a Norwegian one called the Movi strain. So we know that we got salmon from Norway. And as this disease was ripping through their industry, these eggs were coming to British Columbia, and none of them were screened for Piscine reovirus. And it's a very durable virus. It's very tough. It'll even come in on equipment. When it gets released into the Pacific Ocean, nobody really knew what it did until recently. A research paper was just published a few weeks ago. So the only fish that we're sure of what it does to is the Chinook salmon. Now, in the farm salmon and the Atlantic salmon, when the virus gets into the red blood cells and it uses the cells to replicate itself, the cell has like a relief valve, and the virus leaks out and it causes inflammation in the fish's skeletal muscle and in their heart. And the fish are highly damaged, but they can recover from it if there's no predators. But in the Chinook salmon, where it did not co-evolve with the fish, there's no relief. And so the cell just gets bigger and bigger, and it just pops like a balloon, and the virus is released. The fish now loses its red blood cells, so it loses the ability to transport oxygen. The hemoglobin released from the cells damages the kidney and the liver, and so they suffer organ damage. And so for a wild fish, this just means it's game over because the predators are going to destroy you. We don't know yet what it's doing to the other species of Pacific salmon, but we do know that wild salmon around the farms are going extinct. That's how we got it, and that's what it's doing. And yet government is trying to pretend that it's benign, and they're trying to pretend that it's not from Norway. But the Norwegians are very clear. They're like, oh yeah, no, that's our virus. And when you do the phylogenetic analysis, which is like doing a family tree for the virus, yeah, it's Norwegian.
And I think most people comprehend by now that this feedlot style animal farming is unhealthy and cruel on every level. It's unhealthy for the animal, it's unhealthy for the human.
Yeah.
And whether it be cows, chicken, or fish, I just want to make sure the audience has a clear understanding of what salmon farming operations look like before we move on. So you mentioned the netting, but would you paint a more detailed picture for us?
Sure. So they are about the size of a football field, and they're broken down into 10 pens. And the pens are about 40 feet deep, and they have a big feed shed. And in it, they have these huge hoppers where they pour giant sacks of feed, like big barges come. And so they pour about 5 tons of feed into the water every day. The feed rolls down these long tubes and go to each pen. And then there's like a little spinner in the middle of the pen that throws the pellets out into the water. And so look at a farm like at sunset when the sun is low. You can see the greasy stain of the feed, which is super oily. You can just see that stain moving out of the farm. And then when you go down underwater, what you see is this cube of net with up to like 1.6 million farm salmon going around in circles, and the feces are just pouring out. It's like snow. And then they have a second net where seals and sea lions and birds get trapped because everything is trying to eat these fish. There's so many animals that are just built to eat predators. And so they get trapped in these nets. But they're big. Some of them are in round pens as well. Yeah, they're basically these huge, take like a chicken farm, one of those huge sheds that the poor things are in, and you just put that underwater, and all of that waste is coming out. There is no other farmer in North America that is not shoveling his manure. These guys are not shoveling their manure. It's just going straight into the ocean. So underneath the farms, when you put cameras down there, it's a big gray wasteland. If there's any disturbance, it's like this powdery green-gray stuff that almost nothing lives in. There's just this one worm called Capitella that is laced through it, but everything else is gone because, first of all, it's coating the bottom, but second of all, the process of rotting takes oxygen, and so there's like no oxygen down there on that seafloor underneath. And in many farms, you can see bubbles coming up where it's gassing off. It's really disgusting. It wouldn't occur on land because you can see it on land. If you had a feedlot with these giant smears of waste to the, direction of the prevailing winds, and you had parasites that you could see just billowing out of the farms, it wouldn't happen. I mean, feedlots are bad enough on land, but in the water, you don't see it. And the whole thing looks pretty benign from the surface because it's just a few little nets and little nicely painted little green buildings and a couple of guys on it. And, they look great. But when you look underwater, it's just a blizzard of waste coming out of those things.
I've seen the fish farms in BC, and you're right. It's just this small little green building that looks pretty tidy, and these dock-like structures. And you would never know the filth and devastation and the havoc being wreaked underwater. They're really deceptive in that way. I'm wondering, and I almost feel like I know the answer to this question, but how have you seen scientific research being withheld or manipulated to further the agendas of the fish farming industry? Maybe a second part to that was, how has the BC government responded to your scientific findings or the active resistance and long-enduring occupation of fish farms by local First Nations?
Well, any scientist who has the nerve to report a virulent virus, particularly an exotic virus in a fish farm, can expect to have his career destroyed. This has happened in Norway when they found the infectious salmon anemia virus had spread from Norway to Chile. They were under investigation for misconduct. And in my case, the lab that I used, we also found the infectious salmon anemia virus and now Piscine reovirus in British Columbia. We were the first to report both of those. He had his international certification removed. He was accused of all kinds of things. They took away all his government contracts, and they never showed that his lab was wrong. They never showed that any of his test results were different when they were tested in a different lab. In fact, there was an enormous amount of agreement between the labs. With me, they call me an activist. They humiliate me. They say I'm not a doctor of science. That's correct, but I've published over 20 scientific papers which have passed peer review. They say my data does not support my conclusions, but of course it does, or you wouldn't get published, because the journals are very tough on people like me that are not from a big institution. They review you severely, and so they should. And so if somebody thinks my research is suspect, they should contact the journal, and they should provide exactly why they think it's suspect. But they don't. I mean, even when it comes to sea lice, which are an easy thing to study because they're all over the outside of the fish, and it's a problem that is haunting this industry everywhere, Norway, Scotland, Ireland, Eastern Canada. Here in British Columbia, they'll say, oh yeah, no, we don't really think that's a problem. Oh, sea lice are natural. I'm like, oh my gosh, 18 years we've been publishing on this. We have shown how many lice it takes to kill these fish. It's 1 louse per gram of the body weight of the fish. Take the farms out. The wild salmon don't have lice and they return. If you can suppress the lice in the farms, the wild salmon respond. Parts of the coast where there are no farms, there are no lice. The science is just totally done. And they just deny it. They just deny. And that's why First Nations had to stand up and start occupying these farms, because this was not going to be resolved in science, and it was not going to be resolved in the courts, because I'm winning all my lawsuits and nothing changes. They have bright lights on the farms at night, which is attracting tons of herring into these farms. They are the biggest herring fishery on this coast. And the only reason we know that is because First Nations were very brave over the last year, and they've just been boarding the farms and putting GoPros down, which are an underwater camera on a pole. Oh, there's the herring. There's the rock cod. Oh, there's some like really sick looking farm salmon. So, and that's the lawsuit we're fighting today.
Heartbreaking and frightening to be chasing and racing with this virus. I've read that viruses have been described as, quote, the organisms at the edge of life, and they're resilient and adaptable replicators who know how to ride evolutionary waves. So I'm curious, how do you think the vaccination of farm salmon has influenced the evolution of PRV? And do you think that PRV is growing more virulent in response?
Well, so they are vaccinating for some viruses, or they're trying. They haven't figured out this one yet. But the scary thing about vaccinating is in some cases they're using live virus, which is frightening because I don't think these guys are in control of anything they do at this point. There's no evidence they're in control of anything. But the problem with viruses, and you're right, they ride the edge of life. They're not actually alive. And so they need to get into an organism and basically use its machinery. Piscine reovirus invades red blood cells in salmon and uses the red blood cells to replicate itself. And in Pacific salmon, who have no natural defenses, it's just causing their cells to explode. So in the wild, a virus really can't be all that virulent because it kills its host and, well, ship goes down, that's the end of that virus. But in a farm, oh, there's another, 1.2 million fish you can infect. And because there's so many pathogens in there, and weakened fish survive. There's no predators. There's no cleanup crew. I mean, the predators are an amazing cleanup crew. They do not let this happen. They don't allow fish to flounder around so sick they can barely move. But this does happen in the fish farms. And so viruses grow fangs and claws. They become more virulent because they're competing with other viruses and bacteria and parasites. And so the strategy for them changes from live lightly on the land to get in there, replicate as fast as you can because there's no consequences to your host going down because there's going to be somebody else there for you. And so they change their actual genetic structure and become more virulent. And the poor wild fish outside, they're trying to deal with this by dying. The predators do kill them, and in the natural system that would work. But with the farms, kind of like a fire hose of virus coming out, there is no way that nature can get a hold of it and turn it off. So she just keeps killing the wild fish, and they just go down. I mean, right now, juvenile salmon migrating out of the area where I've been doing research since 1984 is almost non-existent. Kingfishers aren't there, the mergansers aren't there. I'm very good at finding these fish, and when you get into a bay where there's lots of juvenile salmon, it looks like rain falling, and there's just empty water there now. They don't have control of this Piscine reovirus. They're still pretending it's not happening because the industry is virtually entirely infected. And the laws of Canada say you can't put a diseased fish in the water, but that's what they're doing. And so in addition to the research, I've been in court for 5 years with the Minister of Fisheries to say you cannot be putting these fish into the water. It's against the law in Canada. I won, and he still refuses to acknowledge this lawsuit. And so I have sued him again. And now, fortunately, so has a First Nation. The Namgis have sued the Minister of Fisheries to stop putting this virus in their waters. So we'll see where that goes. That case will be heard in September.
I guess my question is, I have a lot of questions around this court case that I want to get into. What would they have to change to not, like you said, put this virus in the water? Would the whole system have to be shifted? What are the solutions that you're wanting from the courts?
All I'm trying to do is protect wild fish. The court case is just don't put it in the water. The answer to the industry is a technological one. It's easy. Put them in tanks, for goodness sakes. Close the door. Separate the two environments. And aquaculture might have a role in our society, but you need to create a synthetic ecosystem. In other words, stop right now for these farm salmon. They go fishing, and they go fishing hard. They go fishing in South America and all over the world and grind those fish into pellets and add all kinds of grain products, which humans also could be eating. And then they take out less fish in the water. So if you want to make food, which really isn't their goal, but let's just pretend that they decide that they want to make food and they want to make money doing it, well, start with growing your algae and then grow something that eats the algae and make your own food chain. But isolate it from the natural world, because what people forget, or maybe they never knew, is these natural systems are incredibly powerful and productive and resilient. They will track climate change to as much as is possible. They're way more successful and have far more potential in feeding us than these perverted systems where I say, they go fishing, they use all these petroleum products, and in the end they not only take out less fish, but they've killed everything around them. It is a symptom of some kind of madness. And I don't know how the government of Canada has decided to risk everything on this industry, but it's not about fish. It must be a deal between Canada and Norway, because really all these farms here, there's no Canadians farming in the ocean in British Columbia. It's all Norwegian and Japanese. And there must be some kind of deal somewhere in the stratosphere that we can't even see that is allowing this to persist, because I've tried to work with this government, and I don't mean to be rude, but they are behaving like addicts. They're defiling themselves. Their credibility is shot. Their trade partners are going to be furious at the viruses that are passing over the border in this fish. The good news is, okay, I got to give you some good news, because I'm just dragging you down into the vortex where I live. But the good news is that the First Nations have really taken hold of this monster, and they have rights that I don't have. And I'm not going to be one to say all First Nations are perfect or they're a perfect society, but here's the difference. They evolved amongst the creatures here and the mountains here and the trees and the weather, and they have no intention of leaving. And so you will often hear people say, if it gets any worse, I'm out of here. But First Nations, the Indigenous people, they don't say that. They don't think that. And so they are one of the strongest forces for life for them, it means more than money to most of them. It's their culture, it's in their veins, it's their future. And there's some remarkable science that is evolving in government, which is so interesting, where they can actually read the immune system of fish. And what this does is it allows the fish to talk to us. And so if you sample the fish, you just need a tiny little piece of fin. You don't even need to kill the fish. You sample these fish all through their migration route. When they run into a problem with us, their immune system registers that. And it's a digital signal. It's just these switches that are on, off, and you need people that know how to read them. But the fish will tell you, oh, the water's too warm. Oh, I've got a virus, sea louse. I've got copper poisoning. My liver's damaged. Whatever the problem is. And then we can take that information and we can go back to that spot and go, okay, how did that happen to the fish? Where is that coming from? And we can change our behavior. And then the really cool thing is, the next year we can ask them as they're passing by again, did we make it better for you or not? And they can tell us. And so it is like the legends of the indigenous people of this coast where the fish could talk. They can talk to us again, and we can change our behavior, and we can strategically get out of their way, and we can turn these things back on. We can turn back on the herring, the salmon, then the orca come back, and the forests grow, and people are happy and fed, and tourism blooms, and the non-indigenous governments start showing real consideration and reconciliation towards the indigenous governments. It's a win-win-win, and the government could support the businessmen who want to do land-based aquaculture. So if we can just get back past the addiction stage and allow for an intervention to happen, if they would just look up for a minute, there's so much good and positive and such a good pathway to that involves local people and DFO and the federal government. I mean, the science for that is right in the federal government. So that's what I'm trying to do, is move us along to that point where we just look up and start working in that direction and working with these fish.
I know there's been a lot of buzz around moving salmon farming to land like you've been discussing, and these closed containment systems are already in operation in Norway and Florida and even Vancouver Island. And they're being championed as the righteous way forward because they don't impact wild fish and because they're recirculating tank systems. They don't bring the diseases typical of ocean feedlots. But this question arises in me of, what about the spirit of the salmon and the mindset behind putting these incredible creatures in these tank systems?
Well, I agree with you. And a lot of people feel that way. And also about horrific conditions that our pigs are living in, and cows and chickens. We are ashamed, most of us, and horrified. But here's the thing, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but the ecosystem I'm living in is so on the edge. I'm not even going to make that argument. I'm like a mother who is trying to keep her child alive and is just going to let a lot of things slide because it's so close to death. When you see a river die that had, tens of thousands of salmon, I just didn't imagine that this could happen, although I had heard that it's happened elsewhere. But I have failed, and that river is dying. And if I can save some of the ones around, the salmon will find their way back. And so I'm just going to say, if people can't see our role in the suffering that we're causing, that is something that definitely needs to be dealt with, and it is being dealt with. You see all these eggs now that are free range or happy chickens, or, I don't know whether to believe any of it, but people are moving in that direction, and that is fabulous. It shows a real maturity, because in a lot of ways, we are like, a 3-year-old. We just run around and break stuff because we can. And we really don't want to know that somebody else's feelings have been hurt, or that we've hurt them when we, hit them with a block. But as you mature, you realize, oh, actually that person has the same kind of feelings I have, and I need to respect that. And so hopefully as a species, we get there. But our life support system is coming close to complete failure. And so I have prioritized my focus, and I'm just trying to keep these wild fish alive.
I hear you. And down where I am in Northern California, where there were once salmon so thick you could walk across on their backs, like there are some places in Alaska and even BC, I hope that that's still true. It's not true here anymore. It's a victory if there are one salmon a year you see on some of these tributaries. So I hear your loving desperation to protect the remnants of healthy ecosystems. And I just think to myself, the marketing behind salmon and what has created this greed with salmon all over the world, that you can find salmon in almost every Costco or big marketplace, from anywhere from the West Coast to the East Coast and everywhere in between, places that salmon aren't even close to, Pacific salmon specifically, and how it's touted as this major health food, and salmon oils and pills and vitamins, and it's just marketed. Salmon is really marketed to be this healthy protein with a lot of benefits for our bodies. And of course that is true. But I wonder, at what point does it not become true? At what point do we raise these fish in a way that is so unhealthy that it becomes counterintuitive for us actually to take in these poisoned and enslaved spirit animals? So I have a lot of feelings around the farming of salmon and the marketing behind salmon, but also I absolutely understand where you're coming from. And I'm not coming in with a solution, but just a lot of questions and a lot of heartbreak over the complexity of these incredible kin.
Yeah, well, they're not salmon. Their flesh color is picked from basically paint chips. There's what's called a salmo fan, and the people that are raising these salmon, they pick what color they want these fish to be, because they're not eating a diet that is making their flesh pink. And so they pick a light pink or a medium pink or dark pink. And then when you look at farm salmon and you see the stripes of white, well, that's fat. And that fat is dangerous in many cases. And fat on Earth is becoming dangerous. All fat, you really need to look at where you're getting it from, because PCBs and dioxins bind to fat. And then we eat them and they accumulate in our body. And the only way we get rid of them is by having a baby. And women give over 90% of their toxic load to their first child. So, that's not very comforting. So they're not a healthy thing to eat. And that's, in some ways, that's one of the more hopeful things, is because if people would realize that when your hand is hovering in the supermarket, whether to grab the wild salmon or the farm salmon, grab the wild salmon. And here's why. It is counterintuitive. You think, okay, I'm going to save the wild salmon, so I'm going to eat the farm salmon. And that was the line we were given. But that's not what's happening. If you grab the wild salmon, first of all, you're getting a cleaner product. But second of all, you're feeding a whole system that wants that wild salmon to stay alive. Salmon are so incredibly successful that they can produce, and still do in Alaska, produce enormous runs that support fisheries and still spawn in spectacular numbers. Also in Russia, in the other side of the Pacific Ocean. In other words, wherever there's no salmon farms, there's a lot of wild salmon. But when you pick the farm salmon, oh yeah, you're eating a farm salmon and not a wild salmon, so you might think that's good. That farm salmon has killed a lot of wild salmon, and it also has killed a lot of wild fish somewhere in the ocean to get its food. And then it has these colorants added to the pellets that it's fed. As well, it's been fed probably sea lice drugs. It's been vaccinated. In many cases, they receive antibiotic treatments. So it's not quite as healthy as it appears, and the omega oil ratios are different. So they're duping people, because you see that pink and you go, oh, healthy. salmon. I'll take that. It's not really salmon that you're eating. You're eating a product that's been made to look like salmon.
So, in a sense, these on-land fish farms would be created to fill a market need, but that isn't actually the real salmon. It's kind of just to continue this capitalist game and create jobs based off of this false product.
Well, it's not even to create jobs, because that's another one of their big jokes. They're always saying, well, we're good for small coastal communities. Yeah, I was from a community of 200 people, and you guys moved in, and now there's like 23 of these big Norwegian feedlots. And there's 8 people left in my town. The school is gone. They don't make jobs. They're highly mechanized, and they don't like local people watching them. That is for sure. But when you talk about aquaculture, it doesn't have to be salmon. And I really think that aquaculture, in terms of growing algae, if somebody really wants to get rich making food, I would look at that. And don't pillage the sea for it. Recreate circumstances in which it will grow, because it is the basis of the food chain. You can feed many things, including humans and other animals. There are other people that are exploring insects as a protein source for food, and you take restaurant and refuse from your kitchen, compostables, and grow massive amounts of insects, and you get a protein product out of that, and you can grow fish. There's other people who grow fish, and the waste from the fish is growing plants, and the plants are recirculating the water and reconditioning it for the fish, and you get these closed loop systems, which really is what an ecosystem is. There are ways to do it. I don't know that it can be done on a massive scale. That might be one of the problems, because these corporations, part of the big problem with them is they're only based on growth. They are a cancer model. They can never be satisfied with one farm or 2,000 farms. They have to always have more farms. And I didn't understand this. I'm a biologist, and there's things that I could have really known earlier in this whole fight that might have helped me out. But I went to Norway to the annual general meeting for Marine Harvest and for Cermaq, the two of the biggest companies in the area where I'm working and living. And the evening after the meeting, the CEO of Marine Harvest invited me into her office, and she said, "What do you want?" And I said, "You just have to get your farms off our wild salmon migration routes." And she was very polite and very gracious, and she just said to me, "Look, I can't do that. I have to make the share price of this company go up 4 times a year. I can't lose a single farm." Well, when I realized that, I was like, okay, well then you guys just need to get out, because you're killing us off. That's the problem. It's not only that they're aquaculture, but that they're corporations based on share price. And so they always have to be bigger. And we're living in a finite planet. And so in my view, this is what's killing us off, is we've created an animal that lives in 2 dimensions, is growing rapaciously, eating everything around it, but nature cannot get at it because nature exists in 3 dimensions. But this 2-dimensional monster is protected by the firmest laws in the land. I mean, the laws around corporations are more ironclad than any laws. And so these animals are protected. If you want to see them as in a biological point of view, these weird 2-dimensional creatures, they're just going around, they're just eating things up. They're just puncturing ecosystems until they're a slurry. They're shorting the batteries of life and selling the spark and leaving us with, dead batteries. And then they just move on, and they're not affected because they're not alive. Everything else around them is. The more you pull back on this, the bigger the problem is. And then, of course, the question is that I've started to ask is, are we actually in a democracy? Does what anybody want count? Because I don't see that. And right now, with First Nations standing up, who have these rights on paper, they're saying, look, there is going to be no reconciliation with us if there's salmon farms in our territories. And government is just, you can see the gears are grinding and smoke is coming out and chunks are falling to the ground, and they can't stop. It's an interesting time, that is for sure.
What has your research unveiled about how PRV is impacting not only salmon, but the entire marine community? Perhaps we could hear about sea mammals in particular.
So the orca are based on salmon, and they're based particularly on Chinook salmon. And so a paper that I published last December showed that where wild salmon are exposed to salmon farms, they are far more infected with the virus than distant from salmon farms. And then we found also that there's more infected fish in the lower parts of the rivers than the upper part. And what that suggests in a biological world is that infected fish are having trouble getting up the rivers. And so you're starting to see these collapses in wild salmon populations. And for example, the southern resident orca, or killer whale, in the Salish Sea, so between like Seattle and Vancouver, 69% of the pregnancies in those whales are ending in miscarriages because these fish are starving for Chinook salmon. And Piscine reovirus is causing Chinook salmon cells to explode. And these fish come out of their rivers, they swim by the farms, and the way fish breathe is they take water in their mouth and it passes over their gill, and billions of viral particles are flowing out of the farms, and so they go into the fish's mouth, over the gills, and then bing, they're in contact with their red blood cells. Oh, and the virus goes in the cell and it replicates, and then the cells explode and the fish is dying and the virus is released in the order of, I don't know, millions of copies of itself. And when fish bring it into the low-lying lakes, so lakes that are easy for salmon to get into, they infect the trout, and the trout they don't seem to be affected by it, but they carry it. And so every run of juvenile salmon that comes out and tries to rear in those lakes, they can get infected. And so the southern resident whales are on a trajectory for extinction if something doesn't help them out. The northern resident whales are abandoning the area where these farms are. And so it's called Johnson Straits, and it's a beautiful place where all the salmon from the Pacific Ocean that are headed down these big rivers along Vancouver Island and the Fraser River, it forms like a funnel. They come pouring in. I mean, there used to be so many that they were just jumping everywhere. The air smelled like salmon because there were so many of them in the air at one time. And the orca would come down there and just basically party. They'd socialize, and babies would all get together, and the young males would go off and have fun, and the young mums are all clustered together, co-babysitting, and that's how they develop their culture, because there's so much food they could concentrate on each other. But that's not happening anymore. There's not that many fish, and so they are dispersing, and we don't know what effect that's having on their culture. But we do know that this was a big part of their lives, and so we've obviously changed them in doing that. But I don't want people to think that it's over. I really want you to know that the ocean is still resilient. We still have, humpback whales have made a comeback on this coast. They don't eat salmon, they eat herring. And Pacific white-sided dolphins have, they've also, I think they've finished their cycle, but they peaked and there was thousands of around, and now they've moved off again, and they seem to come in waves. So it's not over yet, but I feel like there needs to be just this one little shift in us. And if when we looked out over a landscape, whatever it is, if we could look at that and go, okay, here's the power lines, here, this works with this is part of this is, okay, how do we fit in? How do we dovetail into that? Rather than what we're doing now, we look at a landscape and go, oh, that's empty. Oh, that mountain's in the way. Oh, let's put a dam there. Oh, that ocean is just doing nothing, when actually it's making most of the oxygen on our planet. Instead of trying to rearrange everything, we need to just figure out how to flow into it. And then I've lived off grid for like 40 years. It's not hard to do. It's incredibly easy, and it's getting easier and easier. You start looking at this massive amount of energy that's all around us and just figure out, everything else works with it. I'm sure we can figure it out too. And we are. from the bottom up. So yeah, I just think there's that one shift that needs to happen in us to create a really fabulous future.
In my dream, following the scene, caught up in a land of in-between, taught it to the band that knows no end, high up in the kite line. The machine plays it on a screen, never say precisely what I mean, always hanging slightly off the edge, sliding to the night time on the way down. It was a cool white blurring light, flash right by my side on the way down.
I too live off the grid, and I remember when I first started living this way, I moved through a lot of fears and this pulling feeling in me to feed my addiction to consumption or basically fossil fuels. And I thought that's what I wanted. I thought that's what I needed because that's how I was conditioned to live my entire childhood and adolescence and young adulthood. But when I started living this way and stripping away all of this conditioning, I realized that not only was, of course, there are its challenges, and in no way is it easy, but it was actually so much more fulfilling to live closer to the earth. It was so much more fulfilling to actually be a part of a system that I was working with rather than just taking from, just pulling myself away from that which I loved more. So I really hear you that there are a lot of solutions. How we put those into motions, how we actually psychologically move through this addiction that you've spoken about a few times on the show is really perhaps the way forward. But of course, doing it on scale is, and when I say scale, whether that's nationally, globally, even county-wide, is challenging. It's really hard to figure out how to get enough people to work outside of the system. But I do feel that there's a lot of hope in that regard. When I think about what we're up against with the Anthropocene, with climate change, I think about the ancient evolutionary history of salmon and how they've persisted at least 15 million years through glaciations, volcanic events, and the rearranging of mountains. Yet perhaps there has never been a time where they face so many compounding threats with such a weakened genetic pool for evolution to draw from. And although it seems that thus far viral diseases have only devastated populations in close proximity to farming operations and not yet severely impacted populations in northern BC or Alaska, I wonder now that the virus is present in Pacific waters, how quickly it will continue spreading, regardless of if the salmon farming industry continues to operate in the open ocean or not. So I guess this question is, will salmon have enough resiliency to overcome the death throes of the Anthropocene?
Yeah, that's the $64 million question for sure. And we don't know the answer to it. What I do know is the sooner we turn this around, the better, because salmon have the ability to rapid evolve. And for everybody who's ever seen salmon in a river or has seen a picture of them, you'll notice that when they're in the ocean, they're all silvery and very, very streamlined. But then they get into the rivers and they turn red, or they get stripes, and they have these humps, or they grow these big teeth. And it's a very strange thing for them to do because they're not feeding, they're growing eggs and sperm, they're swimming against very strong rivers in some cases, warm water, fresh water, shallow water, all these things that are just incredibly stressful and different. But they use the last bit of energy to grow these humps and stripes and put on this regalia. And the reason they do that, and it's the males that are doing it, basically they're saying, hey baby, I went all the way around the Pacific Gyre and I came back with all of this to spare. I have so much energy. I was so successful. I am this wealthy that I could build this enormous hump on my back just to impress you. And the female looks at each of these guys and she's like, no, no, no. Oh, you. Now that choice is why we have such diversity in the genetics of salmon. And say a sockeye salmon in the Fraser River can be a big, deep-bodied Adams River sockeye or a really sleek Chilco River sockeye. And it's because the females are picking them. So don't build a hatchery. As soon as people start picking which fish mates with which fish, you might as well be cutting their tails off, because you're taking away this incredible power that the female has. She can read these males and figure out which one is exactly the best one for her babies. It's amazing. So this is part of this whole figuring out how to live with things and see the power of this natural system and assist rather than think we can possibly do anything better. So, your question haunts me for sure, but giving up, it just isn't an option. And they have survived a lot, and some percentage of them will survive. And if we really get it together and work with them, we can help them come back simply by getting out of their way. They don't need us to do anything for them. Just get out of the way. Where the water's too warm, we need to release more water. Where the fish farms are diseasing them, we need to get them out of there. Where chemicals are being introduced into their migration routes, we need to clean that up. We just need to change our behavior.
From what I gather, you're really excited about some emergent scientific techniques that are opening doorways in how you understand salmon, and that this science may be able to help us renew their ecosystems and support their health. So would you tell us what you've been working on and what all you've been learning?
Sadly, this science is not mine, and I'm just in the trenches trying to push back this wave of disease, the biggest chemical spill in British Columbia, which is these fish farms. So the science is called genomic profiling, and it has a lot of potential. And one of the lead people involved in it is Dr. Christy Miller at the Pacific Biological Station in Nanaimo, British Columbia. She works for the federal government of Canada. She's getting to the point where she can take a cup of water from a river or from a piece of the ocean, and she can tell you not only what fish are in it, but also what viruses and bacteria and parasites are in it. She can look at a salmon and tell, is it fighting disease? Never mind, what is the disease or what is the pathogen, but simply, is this fish healthy or not? And when you do things like that, then you can get the pulse of what is going on around you. You understand, why is this river going down? Oh, it's because it's loaded with this bacteria or this parasite or this predator. And then read the immune system of fish and you can find out, okay, this fish is doing really, really well. Let's take a look at its environment. How did we figure out, how to live around that fish? What are we doing right? Because it's just so important not only to know what we're doing wrong, but to know what we're doing right so that we can do more of that. And I have this concept called the Department of Wild Salmon. And what it would entail is everybody who is already living on the rivers of these fish. And this is largely First Nation communities, First Nation fishery teams, but also stream keepers, universities, hatchery workers. Get everybody to sample the fish and the environment exactly the same way, like measure your water temperature, your pH values, your forest coverage. Take these little tiny samples from the fish, send them in, get the immune system read, and then all of those numbers should go to these genius mathematical modelers that live amongst us. I mean, really, I didn't think you could take numbers and model life, but they actually can. The more numbers they get, the better they can model it. And so then you find out, okay, as soon as it got warm, this happened, or as soon as it got more water, this happened. You get the manual, basically, on what is going on. You can figure out how changes are affecting the fish, how changes are affecting us. And then what I would do is I'd take the people in the field and I'd make sure they went and spent some time in the lab, and I'd take the people in the lab and I'd drag them way out into the wet, wild, messy world of upriver, and so that everybody sees what everybody else is dealing with. And then once a year, I would have a conference to bring everybody together, a gathering, to discuss the results. And then I would have a dance and feasting. And so that all of these people from all over the rivers, of all over the coast, the municipal leaders who are making decisions, the scientists, everybody get together and get to know each other. Because one of the really fascinating things is how much salmon inspire people. People will go to lengths if they think they're benefiting salmon. And if we could just get everybody working together with this phenomenal science, stop pretending that this information is secret or confidential, because in the world of studying viruses is nasty. Oh my gosh. Just open it up, pry it open, and federal fisheries, well, they just become the permitting agency. Don't ask people in Ottawa, way in the interior of this continent, to figure out what needs to be done to bring our fish back. That has to be dealt with the people who are out on the coast, but using top-notch science, not, don't let people make it up. There's all kinds of theories out there, and, people get pretty dug in and entrenched in their theories. It's got to be based in fact. And so this would work. This would absolutely work, because if you went to a small town on a river and you said, you know what, you're killing 24% of this run of salmon because you have this pipe going into the water right here, I'd be quite certain that that municipal community would go, oh, okay, well, let's figure this out. Let's filter it or move it or put it into a settling pond or whatever it takes to make a change. And then instead of just guessing whether you made it better or not, you get to ask the fish, and the fish will be like, nope, you made it worse. Or, yeah, that is fabulous. I'm doing great through here. You didn't impact me at all. Yeah, that's what I'm trying to work towards. And we're just starting the process. You can't wait for government, because government is in some kind of log jam. They're in gridlock up there in the stratosphere. We can't even begin to know what they're doing. And they don't know how to get out of it. But if we just start boots on the ground and just start doing this ourselves, then it starts happening. And we start offering the fish relief as soon as possible. So Washington State actually has outlawed Atlantic salmon farming in this state. And it hasn't happened yet. The companies are allowed to grow the fish out till they're out, but it's the end. British Columbia has this enormous decision to make on the 20th of June. Premier John Horgan, the Premier of British Columbia, has to decide whether he's going to renew the fish farm tenures in a quarter of the industry, because they're all expiring on the 20th of June. And all of these fish farms are in indigenous territories where some of them have been occupying the fish farm facilities for 260 days since last August. They couldn't be more clear that they want this industry out. And then the science is just raining down on them. The chefs in British Columbia are rejecting the farm salmon product. There's all kinds of lawsuits. I'm involved in several of them. So British Columbia might turn that around and start progressing towards a better system here. And then I think we would just get this incredible, Washington State is leading the way, but we'll get this incredible lesson as to how you can work with these natural systems. And I really hope that everybody else who's in the trenches will take heart and see, there is a lot of hope here, and these systems are resilient. And if we just could please get it together as soon as possible, we could still have our spaceship Earth, rather than dismantling it and having it fall apart out here in a really, really hostile universe. We could still have our functioning planet.
So this huge decision is being made just in a few weeks, really, about the salmon farm's tenures in BC. And I'm wondering, for those of us, whether we live in BC or the United States or really anywhere in the world, is there anything that the public can do to support this, whether that's citizen scientists, activists, ocean lovers? What can the audience, the people that are listening today, how can they get involved, or what would the best way they could support?
That's a great question. So everybody lives near a supermarket. If your market has farm salmon in it, let your manager know that whatever you want to say, I don't want to shop here anymore, or I really think you should get rid of this product, or I'm going to do a demonstration in front of your store. Let them know that this is not acceptable. If you are selling BC, British Columbia farm salmon, you are harming the orca communities, this whole coast. The other thing you can do is email Premier John Horgan, and his email address is premier@gov.bc.ca, premier@gov.bc.ca, and tell him if you ever are tourists up in British Columbia, that you won't be coming here again, or you are disgusted with the fact that they're allowing the fish farms, because he is the landlord of the industry, and he has to make this decision. So just let him know that you would support him getting rid of these farms in the water. And, go on Facebook, and the First Nation, the indigenous occupation of the farms in the Broughton Archipelago, it's called. The Facebook page is Swanson Occupation, or you can go to my Facebook page, Alexandra Morton, and you can see what all of the things we're working on. In some cases, it's like donate for this legal fund here right now, please, or write to this person, or simply, just get interactive there, liking the pages, because government is watching those pages. I'm constantly facing my Facebook page in court because of the things people say there. So I know the industry is watching, and I know government is watching. And I just really, like I said at the beginning of this conversation, is you count. You count. You count. You're actually the only thing that counts. It doesn't matter what I do. It doesn't matter what the indigenous people do. They will be ignored. I will be ignored. These animals will go down. Our planet will be destroyed. It's really everybody that has to get involved. There's a certain number of us. If we all do one thing, we can change this. And we don't know how small or how large that number is. So that just means everyone. One of the things I really just makes me cringe when people say to me, they'll say, "Oh, I'm with you in spirit." I'm sorry. It's too late for that. You have to either donate or give your friend some money to come or send something. If you really do care, don't make yourself feel better by just saying I'm with you in spirit, because it really does nothing. You have to do something. I know that we can't engage on everything. There's just too much. And that's why I'm very focused myself. But if you can do that, in your own life, pick the one or two or three things, donate $20. $20 is huge. If enough people donate $20, it's enormous. You can hire a lawyer. You can pack a bus full of people. You can gas up your boat. You can run a virus test. You really, I mean, you got to be careful that you're funding people, obviously, that appear to be doing something, but just take the risk. Because, I have a 2-year-old grandson, and it's very painful to look in his eyes thinking about the future he is going to inherit. And whether we like it or not, the people alive on this planet today, right now, we are going to decide the future of this planet for everyone. Everyone forever. So we need to be superheroes, and I don't mean to make you feel exhausted by saying that, but what are superheroes always doing? They're saving the planet. That's exactly what needs to happen right now. And you can do it with $20. You can do it with how you shop. You can do it in so many ways. And it really feels good. It feels good not to be a victim. It feels good to push back. So there's so many things that people can do. And please, the first one is do not feel like you don't count, because that's a lie. That is something that, we are told, so we will behave in ways that are destroying our future and our children's future. You count. You're essential. You are the most important thing on the planet today.
Wow, thank you so much, Alexandra. I'm feeling riled up and in love and heartbroken and ready to commit to doing something. And I'm so happy you said that being here in spirit or sending good thoughts is really just not enough right now. We actually have to show up and really make a contribution. Whatever that contribution is, we have to actually commit to those ways of being engaged and active in these struggles. So I so appreciate those words. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And what a great show. I've learned so much listening to you. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to For the Wild podcast. I'm Ayana Young. The music you heard today was from Iola and Ben Chase. I'd like to thank our incredible team, our producer-editor, Andrew Storrs, research director, Madison Magulski, and media director, Molly Lebove, and research assistant, Francesca Glassbell. Also, remember that Alexandra is asking for support right now in writing the Premier of BC to respectfully demand that the Premier of British Columbia do away with salmon farms. You can email him at premier@gov.bc.ca. Also, Alexandra is needing financial support right now, so please go to her website at alexandramorton.ca and you can donate there and read more about her research. Thank you so much, and until next time.